Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are jumping straight into a totally fascinating journey back in time to the years 1558 to 1603. We're going to unpack a slice of English history that is so famous it literally got an entire era named after its monarch, the Elizabethan age. But as we pull back the curtain on this iconic period, we really have to ask ourselves a question. How much of what we think we know is actual historical fact, and how much is just, well, spectacular public relations? Let's dive right into this. I want you to try something for a second. Visualize what pops into your head when I say Elizabethan era. Chances are you're picturing those enormous, super stiff white ruffs around people's necks, right? Or maybe you're imagining the grand wooden stages of Shakespearean theater, or even those bold explorers setting sail across the globe. We have this widely romanticized idea of a true golden age filled with prosperity and high culture. And, to be fair, for good reason. There's this quote from the great poet John Milton that absolutely hits the nail on the head regarding the sheer energy of the time. He describes England as a noble and puissant nation, rousing herself like a strong man after sleep. You see, before Elizabeth took the throne, England had suffered through the very short and quite frankly disastrous reigns of her half-siblings, Edward and Mary. We're talking deep religious division and political chaos. So Elizabeth's astonishing 44 years on the throne provided this deeply welcome stability. For the first time in what felt like forever, the kingdom could finally take a breath, look outward, and forge a really powerful sense of national identity. And this newly awakened strength ushered in a pretty remarkable brief window of peace. It was wedged right perfectly between the bloody wars of the roses of the previous century and the devastating English Civil War that, well, nobody knew was still to come. I mean, just look at the highlight reel for the Elizabethan age. Politically and militarily, England pulled off an incredible underdog victory by defeating the mighty Spanish Armada in 1588, totally fending off an invasion by Habsburg Spain. Out on the seas, you had maritime adventurers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh pushing the absolute boundaries of global exploration. And back at home, you had the incredible flourishing of the English Renaissance. But here's the thing. None of this grandeur happened by accident. A massive part of this Golden Age mythos was driven by a literal cult of personality. Elizabeth carefully and honestly masterfully managed her image as the Virgin Queen, this dedicated monarch who completely sacrificed her personal life for the good of her people. Her image was everywhere. It was heavily celebrated in portraits, pageants, literature, you name it. It was brilliant propaganda designed to unify the nation and project the absolute glory of the Tudor dynasty. And, speaking of projecting glory, we absolutely cannot talk about the Elizabethan age without talking about the arts. The year 1576 was a massive milestone. It saw the establishment of the very first purpose-built permanent theater in London. Suddenly, drama, just for the sake of entertainment, became a booming industry. Touring troupes finally settled down, which allowed for incredible investments in stage design and writing. This is the exact stage that gave us the unmatched genius of playwrights like Christopher Marlowe and, of course, William Shakespeare, performing at legendary venues like the Globe Theatre. All right, but here's where we need to take a step back and get a reality check. All of this flourishing culture, all of this exploration, and all of those beautiful theaters, they were built on top of a highly rigid social structure. Elizabeth's society was designed to heavily reflect the order and stability of the crown itself. Everybody had a place. And breaking class expectations, that could result in incredibly severe punishment. Social mobility, at least the way we think about it today, was practically non-existent. Let's actually walk down this social ladder together. At the very top, you have the nobility, with the queen sitting right at the apex. These are people born into powerful families holding immense political rights. Just below them, you've got the gentry, knights, squires, wealthy landowners. Then we hit the middle class, the yeomanry. This group was made up of farmers and tradesmen who lived decently enough, but didn't have much long-term security. And finally, at the very bottom, making up the vast majority of the population, was the peasantry, poor laborers who relied entirely on physical work just to get by. So the crucial point you should take away here is the stark contrast in how these different groups actually experienced this so-called golden age. The gentry was actually the fastest-growing class during this period. They didn't do manual labor. Instead, they built their wealth off the booming arts, sciences, and global exploration. But for the yeomanry and the peasantry, the folks actually growing the food and doing the backbreaking labor, life was incredibly precarious.
Now, what's really interesting about this next piece of data is how it completely shatters that romantic illusion we talked about earlier. According to comprehensive research by economic historians over at the London School of Economics and Oxford University, the Elizabethan age actually lacked a lot of luster for ordinary English families. In fact, their data reveals something mind-blowing. Living standards for the typical rural family literally plummeted to their lowest ebb since the 14th century. So, while the gentry were out watching Shakespeare, the peasantry were quite literally starving. You're probably wondering, why was it so bad? Well, it was a perfect storm of economic hardships. The era was plagued by absolutely devastating poor harvests. Wealthy landowners were busy fencing off, or enclosing, the common lands that peasants heavily relied on to survive. Then you had outbreaks of terrifying diseases like the sweating sickness, this mysterious illness that could shockingly kill a perfectly healthy person in a matter of hours. On top of that, the government debased the coinage, completely destroying purchasing power. And because Henry VIII had previously dissolved the monasteries, the traditional safety net of religious charity was just completely gone. This poverty and vagrancy crisis became so massive and so incredibly visible that the government essentially had no choice but to step in. And this brings us to a really fascinating turning point in history. The sheer desperation of the Elizabethan lower classes accidentally gave birth to the foundations of the modern welfare system. It all started with attempts to basically just stop the bleeding. In 1563, the government passed the Statute of Artificers. This act was essentially damage control, an attempt to artificially stabilize a society that felt like it was in freefall. It aimed to stop competition, rigidly fix local wages, and heavily control the mobility of workers. It legally enforced a moral obligation to work and operated on the assumption that social distinctions were divinely ordered. It was a pretty harsh attempt to keep everyone exactly in their assigned lane. But, they quickly realized that just forcing people to stay put wasn't going to be enough. They actually had to manage the different realities of poverty. So the government did something totally unprecedented for the time. They systematically categorized the poor. They divided them into the able-bodied, which included the quote-unquote deserving poor who wanted to work, as well as the idle poor who allegedly refused to, and the impotent poor, who were completely unable to work due to extreme age, illness, or disability. And all of this categorization culminated in the famous Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601. This right here is where we see the direct ancestors of our modern social safety net. The law required parishes to keep strict records of the poor, and, get this, it actually mandated the taxation of income to fund relief efforts. It ordered the building of almshouses for the sick and workhouses for the able-bodied. It even required mandatory apprenticeships for poor children between the ages of 12 and 18 to ensure they learned a trade. It was a highly structured, even if often punitive, response to a society that was stretched to its absolute breaking point. So, as we weigh the legacy of the years 1558 to 1603, we are left with a really profound duality. On one hand, the Elizabethan age undeniably forged a powerful national identity, defended its shores against incredible odds, and produced some of the greatest literature and theater the English language has ever seen. It was, at the very top, a time of dazzling opulence. But on the other hand, for the vast majority of people actually living through it, it was a time of severe economic depression, strict social control, and immense physical hardship. Which brings us to a really tough question, the ultimate question we must ask when we look back at history. Does a flourishing high culture, the beautiful sonnets, the grand theaters, the global exploration, does that make an era truly golden if the vast majority of its people are just struggling to survive? It's a question that challenges us to look way beyond the royal portraits and the Shakespearean stages, and to consider the real lived experiences of everyday people. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll leave you to ponder that thought.